The Boeing 737 levels off at 34,000 feet over the Aegean Sea, sunlight glinting off its white fuselage as it cruises toward Athens. Inside the cockpit, the captain and first officer sit motionless in their seats, heads tilted forward, hands resting limply in their laps. They are not sleeping, they are not resting. They are unconscious, their brains starved of oxygen, unable to respond to the aircraft they are supposed to be flying. Behind them in the cabin, 115 passengers and 4 flight attendants are similarly incapacitated, some slumped in their seats, others collapsed in the aisles, children motionless beside their parents, elderly couples who boarded hours earlier in Cyprus, excited for their trip to Athens, now silent and still. Nobody is awake, nobody is conscious, nobody can help. The aircraft flies on, autopilot maintaining course and altitude with computer precision, following its programmed route as if nothing is wrong. But everything is wrong. The cabin altitude has reached 34,000 feet, matching the aircraft's actual altitude. The air inside is as thin and deadly as the air outside. Everyone aboard is slowly dying from lack of oxygen, and there is no one conscious to save them. For the next 2.5 hours, this ghost ship will fly across Greek airspace while controllers desperately try to make contact. Fighter jets will scramble to intercept. Pilots will position alongside and peer through windows at the horror inside. And then, when the fuel finally runs out, the aircraft will fall from the sky into a mountainside north of Athens, killing everyone aboard in one of the deadliest accidents in Greek aviation history. Before I walk you through every minute of this tragedy and reveal what caused an entire aircraft full of people to lose consciousness, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is one of the most disturbing accidents in modern aviation, and what investigators discovered changed safety procedures worldwide. I am Captain Paul Henderson. 25 years of flying commercial aircraft have taught me that hypoxia, oxygen starvation, is one of the most insidious killers in aviation. It does not announce itself with alarms and warnings that you can hear and respond to. It creeps up silently, stealing your judgment before you realize something is wrong, taking your consciousness before you can save yourself. Your brain convinces you that everything is fine, even as it shuts down from lack of oxygen. This is the story of Helios Airways Flight 522, the ghost flight that flew for hours with everyone aboard unconscious or dead, and the investigation that revealed how a simple switch in the wrong position, combined with crew confusion and inadequate training, resulted in 121 deaths. Welcome aboard. August 14, 2005. A Sunday morning. Larnaca International Airport on the island of Cyprus. The Mediterranean sun beats down on the tarmac, where a Boeing 737-300 is being prepared for its morning departure to Athens, Greece. Helios Airways Flight 522 operates this route daily, carrying tourists and business travelers on the short 1-hour flight between the islands and the Greek mainland. The aircraft is a Boeing 737-300, registration 5 Bravo Delta Bravo Yankee. It is relatively young, just 7 years old, with a good maintenance record. The previous night, maintenance crews worked on the aircraft, investigating a report of a door seal leak. To test the pressurization system, they placed the pressurization mode selector switch in the manual position rather than automatic. This allowed them to manually control cabin pressure during their ground tests, checking for leaks and verifying system function. When the maintenance was complete, the engineers should have returned the switch to automatic, but they did not. Whether through oversight, forgetfulness, or distraction, they left the pressurization mode selector in the manual position. And when the flight crew arrived for their pre-flight inspection, they failed to notice that this critical switch was in the wrong position. This is not entirely their fault. The pressurization panel on the Boeing 737 is located on the overhead panel, behind and above the pilots' heads. It is not directly in their line of sight during normal operations, and the switch position is not always part of the standard visual scan during every pre-flight check. Many pilots verify the pressurization system is set to automatic during the detailed checks performed before the first flight of the day, but not necessarily for every subsequent flight. But on this morning, that missed switch setting will prove fatal for everyone aboard. Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten occupies the left seat. He is a German pilot, 58 years old with over 35,000 hours of flight time. He is vastly experienced, having flown for decades in both commercial and corporate aviation across Europe. He knows the Boeing 737 intimately, having logged thousands of hours in the type. He is thorough, methodical, professional. His colleagues respect him. His safety record is excellent. First Officer Pampos Karalambous sits in the right seat. He is a Cypriot pilot, 51 years old, with over 7,000 hours of flight time. He has less experience than Captain Merton, but is still a competent, qualified pilot. The two men have flown together multiple times before. They communicate well, work together effectively, trust each other's abilities. 115 passengers board the aircraft through the jet bridge, families beginning vacations in Greece, business travelers heading to meetings in Athens, elderly couples visiting relatives, children clutching stuffed animals, excited for their first flight. They settle into their seats, stow carry-on bags, fasten seatbelts. The cabin crew, 4 flight attendants, complete their pre-flight duties, checking emergency equipment, counting passengers, preparing for a routine 1-hour flight. The weather is excellent. Clear skies over Cyprus and Greece, light winds, no turbulence expected, no storms to navigate around. It should be an easy, pleasant flight. Nothing suggests that within 90 minutes, everyone aboard will be dead or dying. At 9:07 in the morning local time, 7 minutes behind schedule, Flight 522 pushes back from the gate. Captain Merton starts both engines. The CFM turbofans spool up normally, all indications showing green. They complete their after-start checklist and begin taxiing toward the departure runway. During the taxi, something happens that should have been a warning, but is instead misinterpreted. A warning horn sounds in the cockpit. It is the takeoff configuration warning, a horn that normally sounds if pilots attempt to take off with flaps, slats, or other critical systems in the wrong position. But this horn has a dual purpose. It also sounds if the aircraft is above 14,000 feet with inadequate pressurization. Captain Merton and First Officer Karalambous hear the horn during taxi. They are confused. Why would a takeoff configuration warning sound while they are taxiing? They check flap position. Correct. Slat position, correct. Stabilizer trim set properly. Everything appears configured correctly for takeoff. They cannot identify why the horn is sounding. What they do not realize, what they do not understand, is that the horn is not a takeoff configuration warning. It is a pressurization warning. The aircraft, sitting on the ground with the pressurization system in manual mode and not being actively controlled by anyone, has a cabin altitude that already exceeds 14,000 feet. The pressurization system is not functioning, and the warning horn is trying to tell them this. But the pilots, expecting a takeoff configuration warning and finding all takeoff settings correct, assume the horn is malfunctioning. They discuss it briefly but decide to proceed with the flight. This is a catastrophic misinterpretation that seals the fate of everyone aboard. At 9:15, Larnaca Tower clears them for takeoff. Merton advances the thrust levers to takeoff power. The 737 accelerates down the runway, gaining speed rapidly. At rotation speed, Merton pulls back on the control column. The nose lifts. The main gear leaves the pavement. Flight 522 is airborne, climbing into the clear morning sky over Cyprus. The departure is technically flawless. They follow the published departure procedure, turning northwest toward Athens. The aircraft climbs smoothly, systems functioning normally. To an outside observer, everything appears perfectly routine, but inside the cabin something is terribly wrong. The pressurization system, still in manual mode with no one actively controlling it, is not maintaining cabin pressure. As the aircraft climbs through 10,000 feet, the cabin altitude also passes through 10,000 feet. At 12,000 feet actual altitude, the cabin altitude is also 12,000 feet. The cabin and the outside environment are at the same pressure. There is no pressurization. At 14,000 feet, the warning horn sounds again, now properly alerting to the altitude and pressurization problem, but the pilots, having already decided the horn is malfunctioning based on their earlier experience during taxi, ignore it. They assume it is the same false alarm they heard on the ground. As the aircraft continues climbing through 16,000, 18,000, 20,000 feet, the cabin altitude rises in lockstep. The oxygen content in the cabin air is dropping steadily. At 18,000 feet, the oxygen masks should deploy automatically to provide supplemental oxygen to passengers. But the system that deploys the masks is also controlled by cabin altitude sensors, and if those sensors are malfunctioning, or if the deployment system is not working properly, the masks may not deploy when needed. In this case, the masks do deploy. At approximately 18,000 feet cabin altitude, Panels above the passenger seats open, and yellow oxygen masks drop down, dangling in front of startled passengers. But by this time, many passengers are already experiencing the effects of hypoxia. Their judgment is impaired, their vision is tunneling, their motor skills are degrading. Some may not understand what the masks are for. Others may try to reach for them, but lack the coordination to grasp them properly and pull them over their faces. And the oxygen masks in commercial aircraft are designed for emergency descents, not for prolonged use at high altitude. They provide supplemental oxygen for approximately 12 to 15 minutes, enough time for pilots to bring the aircraft down to a safe altitude where masks are no longer needed. But if the aircraft continues climbing instead of descending, if the pilots do not recognize the emergency and take action, the masks will only delay the inevitable. In the cockpit, Captain Merton and First Officer Charalambous are also being affected by hypoxia. At 20,000 feet cabin altitude, the oxygen saturation in their blood is dropping dangerously low. They may be experiencing euphoria, a common symptom of hypoxia. They may feel lightheaded, slightly intoxicated. Their thinking is becoming muddled, their reactions slowing, their ability to process information and make good decisions failing. At 9:20, 15 minutes after takeoff, Athens Control tries to contact the flight for a routine handoff. Helios 522, Athens Control, good morning. No response. The controller waits, then tries again. Helios 522, Athens Control, how do you read? Still nothing. The aircraft continues climbing, now passing through 30,000 feet. On the controller's radar screen, the transponder shows the flight climbing steadily, maintaining its programmed course, but there is no voice communication, no acknowledgement of the radio calls. Inside the cockpit, both pilots are likely unconscious now, or very close to it. At 30,000 feet cabin altitude, consciousness is measured in seconds. They may be slumped in their seats, breathing shallowly, their brains shutting down from lack of oxygen. If you are as horrified by this as I am, go ahead and hit that like button right now. And make sure you stay subscribed, because what happens over the next 2 hours is one of the most tragic spectacles in aviation history. Share this video, because understanding how pressurization failures kill is critical for everyone who flies. The aircraft levels off at 34,000 feet, its programmed cruising altitude. The autopilot maintains heading and altitude perfectly. The engines run smoothly. Every system functions exactly as designed, but everyone aboard is incapacitated by hypoxia, unconscious, or rapidly losing consciousness. Athens Control continues attempting to contact the flight. They try multiple frequencies. They ask other aircraft to attempt contact on air-to-air frequencies. They send data link messages. Nothing produces a response. The aircraft flies on in complete silence. At 9:37, the Greek Air Force is notified. 2 F-16 fighter jets scramble from Tanagra Air Base, climbing rapidly to intercept the unresponsive airliner. This is standard procedure post-September 11th. An aircraft that does not respond to radio calls is treated as a potential threat, requiring immediate investigation. The fighters reach Flight 522 at approximately 10:20. The lead pilot positions his F-16 alongside the Boeing, close enough to see clearly through the cockpit windows. What he reports sends chills through everyone monitoring the situation. The captain's seat appears to be empty. I can see the first officer slumped over the controls, not moving aft to check the cabin. He maneuvers to look through the passenger cabin windows. I can see the oxygen masks are deployed. I can see passengers in their seats, motionless. No one appears to be conscious. No one is looking out the windows or acknowledging my presence. This information is relayed immediately to Greek authorities and to Helios Airways. Everyone aboard appears to be unconscious or dead. The aircraft has become a ghost ship, flying itself across Greek airspace with no one able to control it. The fighters continue escorting the 737 as it flies in a holding pattern programmed into its flight management computer. The aircraft makes wide, lazy circles over the Aegean Sea, burning fuel, slowly descending as the autopilot tries to maintain altitude with decreasing weight. But then, at approximately 11:49, something remarkable happens. One of the flight attendants, Andreas Prodromou, regains partial consciousness. Unlike the others, Prodromou has additional training beyond standard flight attendant qualifications. He holds a commercial pilot license with over 600 hours of flight time. He is not type-rated on the Boeing 737 and is not qualified to act as a crew member on this aircraft, but he understands aviation and aircraft systems better than a typical flight attendant. Prodromou had been using a portable oxygen bottle, the type flight attendants carry for medical emergencies. This bottle provided him with supplemental oxygen that kept him alive longer than the others. When he regains consciousness or enough awareness to move, he finds himself in a nightmare. The cabin is full of unconscious or dead passengers. The oxygen masks dangle uselessly. The aircraft is flying itself. The cockpit crew is clearly incapacitated. He makes his way forward to the flight deck. The cockpit door on Helios Airways aircraft is not the reinforced locked door that became standard after September 11th. He is able to open it and enter. He finds Captain Merton collapsed on the floor behind the seats. The captain had apparently left his seat at some point, perhaps trying to check on passengers or retrieve emergency oxygen, and had collapsed before reaching his objective. First Officer Charalambous is slumped in the right seat, unresponsive, almost certainly dead. Prodromou sits in the captain's seat. He puts on the captain's oxygen mask, which is supplied by the aircraft's main oxygen system and will provide breathable air. He looks at the instrument panel, sees the warnings, understands immediately that this is a pressurization failure and that everyone has succumbed to hypoxia. The fighter pilots, still flying alongside, see movement in the cockpit. They see someone in the captain's seat. They report this to ground control. There is someone alive up there. Someone is trying to take control. Prodromou attempts to communicate via radio, but he is not familiar enough with the 737's radio systems to operate them correctly under these conditions. He cannot figure out which frequency to use or how to transmit. The fighter pilots try to get his attention, rocking their wings, attempting visual signals, but he is focused on the instruments, trying to understand the aircraft's situation. He can see they are low on fuel, very low. The gauges show both tanks nearly empty. He realizes the aircraft will run out of fuel soon, that the engines will quit, that they will crash. He tries to figure out how to descend, how to land, but he has never flown a 737. He is not trained on its systems. He does not know the procedures, and he is working alone with no co-pilot, no help, breathing from an oxygen mask, trying to save an aircraft he is not qualified to fly. At 12:03, the left engine flames out, its fuel supply exhausted. The aircraft is now flying on one engine. The autopilot compensates, adding rudder and aileron to maintain straight flight, but the single remaining engine is also running on fumes. 6 minutes later, at 12:09, the right engine also flames out. Both engines are now silent, their turbines spinning down as fuel flow ceases. The aircraft is now a glider, a 100-ton metal tube with no power, no thrust, beginning its final descent toward the Earth below. The autopilot disconnects automatically when both engines fail. Prodromou now has manual control of the aircraft, but he is not prepared for this. The aircraft begins descending rapidly. He pulls back on the control column, trying to maintain altitude, but without engine power there is no thrust to keep the aircraft in the air. It is descending at over 3,000 feet per minute, falling toward the mountains north of Athens. He attempts to guide the aircraft toward a clear area, perhaps hoping to make an emergency landing in a field or open space, but the terrain below is mountainous, covered with forests and rocky hillsides. There are no suitable landing sites. At 12:12, Flight 522 impacts a hillside near the village of Grammatiko, approximately 25 miles north of Athens. The aircraft is in a steep descent, traveling at high speed when it strikes the ground. The impact is catastrophic, instantaneous, totally unsurvivable. The 737 disintegrates on contact with the mountainside. The fuselage breaks into dozens of pieces, scattering wreckage across a wide area. The wings separate, fuel tanks rupture. Fire erupts immediately, consuming what remains of the aircraft and spreading through the dry vegetation on the hillside. The crash site becomes an inferno, flames and smoke visible for miles. All 121 people aboard die. The 115 passengers who boarded in Cyprus, the 4 flight attendants and the 2 pilots. Andreas Prodromou, the flight attendant who regained consciousness and tried desperately to save the aircraft, dies in the crash along with everyone else. His heroic attempt to take control was ultimately futile. The aircraft was doomed the moment it took off with the pressurization system in manual mode. Emergency services reached the crash site within 40 minutes, But it is immediately clear there is nothing they can do. The wreckage is scattered across a steep, rocky hillside. Fire is still burning in multiple locations. There are no survivors, no intact bodies, no hope of rescue. They can only secure the area and begin the grim work of recovery. The investigation that follows is exhaustive and deeply disturbing. The Hellenic Air Accident Investigation and Aviation Safety Board leads the inquiry, assisted by Boeing, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the National Transportation Safety Board. Investigators recover the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder from the wreckage. The data they contain tells the story of the tragedy in chilling detail. The cockpit voice recorder captures the confusion in the cockpit when the warning horn sounds during taxi. It records the pilots discussing why the horn is sounding, but failing to identify it as a pressurization warning. It captures their decision to continue the flight despite not understanding the warning. After takeoff, the recorder captures the sound of the warning horn continuing to sound at intervals. The pilots discuss it occasionally, but do not take it seriously, convinced it is a malfunction. Their voices gradually become slurred and disjointed as hypoxia sets in, exactly the pattern investigators would expect. Speech becomes confused, responses slow, communication breaks down. The last clear words on the recorder are approximately 18 minutes after takeoff. After that, there are only mechanical sounds, engines, air conditioning, automated call-outs, and the continuous blaring of the warning horn that nobody conscious can hear. The flight data recorder shows that the pressurization mode selector remained in manual throughout the flight. It shows the cabin altitude rising steadily during the climb, matching the aircraft altitude. It shows no attempt by the crew to manually control pressurization, suggesting they never recognized what the problem was. The investigation determines the primary cause of the accident. The pressurization mode selector was left in manual instead of automatic, and the flight crew failed to identify and correct this configuration error. But the investigation also identifies multiple contributing factors. The maintenance crew that performed the pressurization system test failed to return the selector to automatic after completing their work. This was a direct violation of maintenance procedures. After any maintenance that requires a system to be placed in an abnormal configuration, the system must be returned to its normal configuration before the aircraft is released for flight. The flight crew failed to identify that the pressurization system was not in automatic during their pre-flight checks. While the switch is not in an easily visible location, it should have been verified as part of the pre-flight procedure. Both pilots missed it. The flight crew misidentified the warning horn. They thought it was a takeoff configuration warning when it was actually a pressurization warning. This confusion was catastrophic, delaying their recognition of the problem until hypoxia had already begun to impair their judgment. By the time they might have realized what was wrong, they were already too compromised to respond effectively. Helios Airways had inadequate training procedures for pressurization failures and hypoxia recognition. The airline had also been cutting costs, reducing training time, pressuring crews to maintain schedules even when aircraft had minor maintenance issues. The aircraft itself had a design issue that contributed to the confusion. The warning horn used for both takeoff configuration warnings and pressurization warnings was ambiguous. Pilots could easily misidentify which problem the horn was indicating, especially if they were not specifically trained to distinguish between the two uses. Boeing has since modified this design on newer aircraft, providing distinct warnings for different problems. In the aftermath of this tragedy, sweeping changes were implemented across the aviation industry worldwide. Airlines enhanced their training on hypoxia recognition and pressurization system failures. Pilots now regularly undergo training in altitude chambers, where they experience mild hypoxia under controlled conditions, learning to recognize the symptoms in themselves so they can respond more quickly if it occurs during flight. Maintenance procedures were significantly tightened. Anytime a system is placed in an abnormal configuration for testing or maintenance, multiple verification steps are now required before the aircraft is returned to service. Checklists must be signed off by multiple personnel. Final inspections must confirm all systems are in their normal operating configurations. Boeing modified the warning systems on 737 aircraft to provide clearer, more distinct alerts for different types of problems. The ambiguous warning horn was replaced with more specific enunciations that are harder to misidentify. Pressurization warnings now include visual alerts on primary flight displays, in addition to audio warnings. Aviation authorities around the world mandated more comprehensive pressurization system checks as part of pre-flight procedures. The pressurization mode selector must now be verified to be in automatic before every flight, not just during the first flight of the day. For me, as a pilot who regularly flies pressurized aircraft, this accident is a stark reminder of how quickly things can deteriorate when pressurization fails at high altitude. The crew of Helios Flight 522 had perhaps 2 to 3 minutes from the time hypoxia began to seriously impair their judgment until they lost consciousness completely. During that brief window, they needed to recognize what was happening, don oxygen masks, declare an emergency and begin an immediate descent. But they never recognized the problem. The warning horn that should have alerted them was misinterpreted. By the time physical symptoms of hypoxia might have given them a clue, their judgment was already too impaired to process the information correctly. They simply slipped away, probably feeling confused but not alarmed, possibly even euphoric, unaware that they were dying. The passengers likely fared no better. The oxygen masks deployed, but many passengers were probably already too impaired to use them correctly. Children and elderly passengers would have been particularly vulnerable, and even those who managed to get masks on properly only bought themselves 15 more minutes of consciousness. When the masks ran out of oxygen, they would have succumbed just like everyone else. Andreas Prodromu's attempt to save the aircraft was remarkable and heroic. He regained consciousness when almost everyone else was dead. He made it to the cockpit. He understood what had happened. He tried to take control and land the aircraft. But he was asking the impossible of himself, to fly an aircraft type he had never trained on, to make an emergency landing with no engines, to do it all alone while breathing from an oxygen mask. He gave it his best effort, and he came closer than anyone could have expected. But the odds were simply too overwhelming. The image of that Boeing 737 flying for hours across Greek airspace, everyone aboard unconscious or dead, escorted by fighter jets whose pilots could only watch helplessly, remains one of the most haunting in aviation history. 121 people died because a switch was left in the wrong position and because the crew did not recognize the warning signs in time. This tragedy changed pressurization procedures and warning systems worldwide, and those changes have undoubtedly saved lives in the years since. If this story taught you something about aviation safety you did not know before, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more real aviation investigations. Give this video a like to help spread awareness about the dangers of hypoxia and pressurization failures. And share it with anyone interested in aviation, because understanding these tragedies is how we prevent them from happening again. Your engagement helps me continue bringing you these critical safety stories from the cockpit. I am Captain Paul Henderson. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult and tragic story. Remember that pressurization is not optional at high altitude. It is life support. A pressurization warning requires immediate action. Oxygen masks on first, then emergency descent. Every second counts. Hesitation kills. And always verify that your pressurization system is in automatic before takeoff. Fly safe. Know the symptoms of hypoxia. And never ignore pressurization warnings, no matter how convinced you are that they must be false alarms. Until next time, this is Captain Paul Henderson, signing off.